Hello. What I want to do in this lecture is consider the characteristics of late adolescence. You will notice that I have decided to utilize the schema of early, middle, and late adolescence as opposed to early and late, early, middle, and late. I've already indicated that there are some issues with this categorization, and I intend to hit some of those issues in this lecture. And you will see as we get through this that I don't necessarily agree with J.J. Arnett, but let's step into this and see. So I've talked about early adolescence and middle adolescence. I've specifically looked at the markers of the early onset of adolescence, puberty particularly. We've considered multiple selves, and we've considered objectification, and how these weave into more specific realities that we need to deal with. But when we are dealing with adolescence, one of the things we needed to determine is just when adolescence ends. I have taught for some time that if we're going to be effective in reaching adolescence, then we need to know, lost my place. We need to determine if, we need to know where they are, and we need to be aware of the obstacles that prevent or slow down the psychosocial and spiritual development. The continuing challenge, however, is that adolescence is a moving target, so it's constantly changing. And I believe in the last couple of weeks, the last few lectures, I've marshaled some evidence that demonstrates biologically that adolescence is beginning earlier. Interestingly, and I think this is interesting, that youth ministry's collective eye has focused on the other end of the journey. Now, if John Sandtrock is correct in that adolescence ends in culture, this strongly suggests that youth ministry is taking place in an environment never before realized. Now, determining when adolescence ends and adulthood begins is extremely difficult. Prior to our current cultural context, roughly a few decades ago at most, one was said to be an adult when one graduated from high school, and for one was graduated from high school. One was said to be an adult when that happened. They would have individuated. They were understood to have developed a core self, a unique core self. Now, that was true whether one went on to college or went straight into the workplace. The person was understood to be an adult. This is no longer generally the case. J.J. Arnett, citing years of his own research, suggests that those on the upper end of the adolescent journey should be known as emerging adults rather than late adolescents or young adults. Now, his argument as to why this group, 18 to 21 or 23, is not late adolescents or young adults has, in my estimation, only muddied the already murky waters of adolescent developmental research. What is helpful, however, in my estimation, are what he calls the top 3 criteria for adulthood. Accepting responsibility for oneself, making independent decisions, and becoming financially independent. I find that these 3 criteria to be very helpful. They are true, in my estimation, of anyone at that age, and are really they are gradual, and I think now probably occur incrementally. That is, it's taking longer for young people to transition into adulthood, and this is widely accepted. It's well accepted. And perhaps it's best to acknowledge that and just kind of leave it there. But crossing that threshold is generally taking more time, and recognizing the rather fluid nature of the landscape is important to help one navigate the journey. In my estimation, emphasis and debate upon the age and stage effectively turns the research eyes from the important developmental changes taking place in junior high and high school. And I think multiple selves and the reality of objectification and some of the other things that we've talked about have contributed to this lengthening of adolescence. Now, what we know is this, that an early adolescent has the beginnings of abstract thought, though they still think very black and white categories, but their ability to think abstractly is developing. As they transition into high school, the mid-adolescent has a greater abstract thought. Some might even say full-on abstract thought. And they can think like they can think about you thinking about them. The question then is, what happens when a mid-adolescence transitions to late adolescence? Now, the reality is that mid-adolescence was not a high school psychosocial phenomenon prior to the 90s. Because of systemic abandonment and other societal factors, early and late kind of gave way to this middle stage. Now, I hate using the word stage, but this is a period of development never before seen in the literature. So what it did effectively is kind of push late adolescence towards what we would now call college age. But I don't think people are generally satisfied with calling college age students adolescents, even if late adolescents. Now, university systems have long believed that incoming students were adults. In fact, the whole program, the whole system assumes that these students are adults. And this is based off the old industrial system, much like the one that you and I grew up in. At 18, I had a core self, I had individuated, I had figured out who I was, and I was an adult. I was a young adult. I was immature in many ways, but I kind of had those three markers that I had already mentioned. I had moved from late adolescence, which was at that point the high school psychosocial reality. I had moved from late adolescence into young adulthood or adulthood. The reality is that's no longer the case. So what I want to do here is present to you what I understand to be an emerging concern. I'm not so much going to talk about late adolescence as much as I'm going to share with you some of my research and how this has led to my current understanding of this age group. A little more differently than perhaps you're reading in Arnett. You know, Arnett's information is good. His research is on a very particular age group of students, but I do not think he takes into account how what's going on in the earlier stages impact the age group he is studying. So I'm going to take the very bold position here and run counter to prevailing culture or the widespread accepted and almost blind acceptance of emerging adulthood as a unique stage of psychosocial development. So what is emerging adulthood? I will get into this more later, but Arnett has been working on this for some 20 years. Early on in his research, really only scholars knew about it, and only a very little slice of scholarship really knew or even bought into his theory. It wasn't until the publishing of the second book of the National Study of Youth and Religion by where Christian Smith, in his introduction, identified emerging adulthood and Arnett as that which described what they were seeing. From that point on, the term has taken off. It has become widespread and, in my estimation, has only created issues. So, here is my emerging concern. In earlier lectures, I've presented an argument for taking a different path when considering the development of adolescence. Now, I agree with Susan Harder. The old standby theories need to be reconsidered when it comes to adolescence, especially when we realize that the most prominent of those developmental theorists that so much of our understanding rests on, so much of their work occurred before the onset of mid-adolescence. Culture has changed, family has changed, and so too have adolescents. Now, my position on considering or taking a different path has to do with my own experience in research, but not just my own experience. This is what I've also seen anecdotally and qualitatively in others' experiences and research. I have alluded to this concern in earlier lectures, and now I'm going to treat it in full here. Cognitive attainment of adolescence is taking longer. Now, this could certainly be a marker, like I discussed above, But I want to set it apart in this lecture because the other markers and the sub-aspects of those markers, I think when kind of woven together, are contributing to and perhaps even creating this reality. Now, I transitioned into full-time teaching on the university level in the fall of 2008. In my first semester of teaching, I discovered that the majority of my freshmen and many of my sophomores were manifesting some of the same psychosocial characteristics as the high school students in the youth ministry I had just left. Now, I know there's only a few months separating graduation from high school and the beginning of the freshman year. But the institutional wisdom held that these incoming students were adults, and my experience of them was anything but that. So what I discovered was that they were manifesting the same characteristics of the mid-adolescence that I had been ministering to and within high school ministry. And significantly, what I was able to identify, and once you really begin to learn the reality of multiple selves, I was able to identify that my students had not integrated their multiple selves. It became the key marker that was easily identifiable in this group of students. I also found myself in conversations with colleagues who reported that their students seemed to be less mature. Does it seem like our students are less mature? And I verified these anecdotal findings at other universities. And after a series of events and a bit of time, a colleague of mine and I presented qualitative research at the annual SACS COC conference in Orlando, Florida. Now, SACS, the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools Commission on Colleges, this is the major accrediting agency for universities across the Southeast. So you think of any major university, legitimate university, they're going to be accredited by SACS. And we presented, we did at this national meeting in Orlando, we presented qualitative and phenomenological evidence that contemporary college students were not as cognitively prepared for the college experience as students several decades ago. Now, we attributed this diminishment to the psychosocial phenomenon of extended adolescence. And then what we did was we suggested ways that student services, faculty, assessment leaders, etc., might respond. Now, that session generated substantial discussion and was well received. In the evaluations, the need for quantitative data appeared frequently. This was a lacuna we admitted freely at the time, at the very beginning of the presentation. But the overwhelming response of our colleagues in this session encouraged a redoubling of efforts to determine what and why this was occurring. Now, blaming cognitive diminishment on extended adolescence was then and still is, it seems to me, rather vague. And I soon realized that the key to understanding the diminishment lied in understanding the psychosocial reality that turned me on to this issue in the first place, the mid-adolescent multiple selves. Was I experiencing a lengthening of mid-adolescence among my students? That was my question. This is the question I really began to grapple with. This question runs counter to some of the prominent theories surrounding this age group. But what was plain to us, however, was that our incoming students lacked the cognitive developmental acumen to integrate themselves. Our colleagues and I had, and still are, experiencing diminished cognitive abilities among our undergraduate students. So way back in the spring of 2013, myself and a couple others launched a longitudinal study to gather new quantitative evidence. We wanted data. After 1 year of data collection, our research suggested that the rate at which 18 to 20-year-olds are attaining the level of cognitive development expected of them in previous decades has slowed. Now, this psychosocial reality has significant implications on the expected academic, moral, and social performance of incoming students. With this evidence, qualitative and quantitative, the current developmental paradigms, in my estimation, need to be revisited. What our research demonstrates is that it is taking longer for young people to transition through adolescence. So the adolescent journey is lengthening. That is, it's taking a child longer to journey through that time period of adolescence. Think of it as a period of liminality, a time of in between. Look up liminality, you'll see what I'm talking about. So whatever age or stage theory one holds to, at this point it's really irrelevant. The issue is not the young people, whether one refers to them as adolescents, mid-adolescents, or late adolescents. The issue is they're not reaching cognitive attainment as soon as those in the same age group once did. The speed of attainment has slowed. It is simply taking longer for adolescents to attain the requisite cognitive abilities to transition into emerging adulthood or young adulthood or adulthood, whatever you want to call it. When we witnessed this diminished ability in the classroom and across our campus and on other campuses, we tend to hold the opinion that these students are coming to us dumber. That this is what I often hear from colleagues. It seems like our students are just dumber. But this is not so. They're not coming to us dumber. They're arriving on our campuses less cognitively mature. The question then is, why? Why is this happening? Now, I'm not a brain scientist, and I've been hesitant to rush to much of the brain research. But I am aware that in brain research, present-day brain research claims that the prefrontal cortex doesn't fully develop until the mid to late 20s. But brain research doesn't adequately explain this. What I mean by that is this. If current students, you cannot make a statement about what the brain was doing 20 plus years ago. If they're functioning at higher cognitive levels 16, 17, 18 years ago than students are now, the brain research or the current conclusions about the prefrontal cortex don't accommodate that. They don't address that concern. I think there's something else going on there. I believe the larger answer to the question lies in what I've been trying to develop and the trajectory that I'm taking us on. I believe that what we are experiencing in our classrooms and what the data demonstrates are the result of the cumulative impact of adolescents who have been left on their own to journey through adolescence. Now, Chuck Clark recognized the damaging effects of systemic abandonment in his HURT research. You guys have read that. When kids are systematically left to their own devices to individuate, that is, to become adults, that is, to develop a unique self and figure out who they are, that progression is slowed. And it is slowing. The evidence for the need of increased adult support is convincing. Dr. Susan Harter cites credible research that, quote, cognitive solutions will not necessarily emerge automatically with development, nor will the potential benefits of moving into late adolescence necessarily accrue. Development may be delayed or even arrested if there is not sufficient support for the transition to higher levels of conceptualization. There is compelling evidence for the role or support of scaffolding at higher levels of cognitive development, end quote. Another researcher by the last name of Dahl argues that it is absolutely crucial for adolescents and young adults to have access to adult social scaffolding. So what I'm suggesting is that the cumulative effects of low adult support, or to put it another way, conditional adult support, and the lack of healthy adults, the presence of healthy adults is contributing to what we see as the slowdown of cognitive attainment in adolescence. Now, what we found at my old institution at Lubbock Christian University, research we uncovered from Texas Tech, research that was presented to us from Texas A&M Kingsville, all demonstrated that the incoming students were scoring lower in cognitive attainment than high school freshmen and sophomores of some 16 plus years ago. So it's not that they're coming to us more stupid, more dumb. It's that they have not yet reached the cognitive attainment that previous generations had reached. So the reality is they will reach it. It's just taking them longer to get there. So as adolescents progress through adolescence, there is greater need for adults, greater need for social scaffolding from adults if one is going to achieve optimum cognitive development. Now, we all know those children who do not appear to manifest these realities. Excuse me. Yes, that's what I wanted to say. We all know those children who seem to be ahead of everyone else, seem to be more advanced, seem to be able to think critically, more mature. These are exceptions. My own experience is that these children tend to come from pretty strong homes, and have had cadres, if you will, of adults around them, supporting them through their journey. So what I'm saying about late adolescence or this age group is generally true. Are there exceptions? Yes, those exceptions stand out. And they come in at higher levels of performance. But I think the exception to what I'm explaining proves my point. That they are exceptions, that there are so few of them, demonstrates that something is going on here. Is it possible that what I am witnessing and others are witnessing on the college campus is the cumulative result, the cumulative impact of years of diminished adult support? That is, agenda-free, loving adults, adults who support, not use, as we talked about earlier. I think the implications and opportunities for the church here are substantial. Now, my hope is that this is a substantial enough introduction in 22 minutes to now engage this conversation a bit more critically. We'll continue this as we go. Blessings and peace.